Hey, friends. Andy Paul here, host of the Sales Enablement Podcast. Now, in this session, I'd like to introduce Amy Volas, who is going to field your questions live. With more than $100 million in revenue sold and named one of Sales Hacker's most dynamic women in sales, Amy is a sales fanatic turned entrepreneur. She was bitten by the startup bug many moons ago and couldn't imagine spending her time anywhere else. She created Avenue Talent Partners to help with the tremendous task of growing startups through some of their most valuable assets, meaning executive sales leaders, and enterprise salespeople. Now, let's get into it.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the final session of the Ring DNA Selling Forward Summit. I'm Andy Paul, and with me is Amy Volas. Amy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you? Good to be with you finally.
Well, yes, we've spoken and communicated online, but yeah, great to finally see you face to face. So, just a little bit of background on Amy for people that don't know her. With more than 100 million in revenue sold and named one of Sales Hacker's most dynamic women in sales, Amy is a sales fanatic turned entrepreneur. She was bitten by the startup bug many moons ago and couldn't imagine spending her time anywhere else. She created Avenue Talent Partners to help with the tremendous task of growing startups through some of their most valuable assets, executive sales leaders, and enterprise salespeople. So, Amy, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. This is a fun conversation to have. So thank you for moderating it.
Yeah, well, hopefully it hopefully will be moderate. so, let's
I love
sort of an easy question is you believe there are no shortcuts in sales, and yet, especially when it comes to hiring salespeople and the people that you're trying to help, the assets you talk about, sales leaders, executive sales leadership, enterprise salespeople, hiring managers taking shortcuts all over the place. And so, what are the most common shortcuts you've seen? The most common, maybe the most destructive that you see that hiring managers make?
I think that the number one thing that I see that I hear about through all the years has been all, and I don't think it's a statement that's made consciously. I think it's a subconscious thing of um, getting caught up in the shiny object syndrome, as I like to call it. So it's like, this person went to President's Club, they're going to be a great seller. This person worked at this company, they've got a great playbook. And it's
Mm,
sort of mindset of all companies or all people are created equal, and treating the hiring process as a one-dimensional thing to that without really peeling back the layers to understand, well, what does my business need at my stage for what our buyers demand? And on the flip side, what does this person bring to the table, and does that correlate with our task at hand? And I think a lot of people take a backseat approach, or they get referred to somebody and it's like, well, this is a referral, that person must be great, and the referral is just, the son of a person that this person played golf with, and you have no idea whether they can really do the job well for you and your buyer or not. So that's one of the main reasons.
yeah, and I think one of the things that sort of where it all emanates from is that it's such a painful process to hire people that, to the point you sort of made earlier, is people look for the shortcuts or the path of least resistance, the shiny object. I mean, I had one client, I remember I had urged him, I said, don't hire anybody unless you let me talk to the people first. But somebody came into his office, a guy, well dressed, incredibly well spoken, and he was just taken with him personally. Turned out to be a horrible disaster as a salesperson, but it was that shiny object. He looked good. He thought he'd represent the company really well out in the field, except, he couldn't sell anything.
Exactly. Well, and I find that a lot of people don't know how to hire salespeople, right? Or they don't know what that process needs to look like. And if you back into the problem of getting it wrong, so I'm a big fan of the book Top Grading, and
Hmm.
they talk about the consequences of that. So it's like, it's on average 300 hours invested, like 300 hours at an ideal in the startup world. That's a lot. Plus
300 hours of management time to hire somebody?
300
Or-
hours invested in the hiring process in totality, right? So you've got that, you've got the cost of finding the replacement and the time invested in that. And then on top of that, you've got the cost of the person. And Deloitte's estimate is you're spending 200 to 300% more uh, than than what you originally spent. Like it's a multi-million dollar problem to the tune of, like, for bigger companies. So it's not just startups. Zappos came out publicly and said we spent over $100 million in mishires. Like, if you think about $100 million and you think about startups, which is where I deal,
Hmm.
that's like the golden number to get to unicorn status, right? Like, that's like
Yeah.
that's a lot of money. And so I think that taking there's so many people that I've said, have you thought about before you've hired what that looks like? And I can't tell you, Andy, how many times people have said to me, well, I don't really have a lot of time. So I went to AngelList or I went to LinkedIn and I found a job description and that looks like what we need. So I just pulled it off there. And it's like, I know time is of the essence here, but it's that old adage of kind of what you put into something is what you're going to get back out of it. And if you don't really know what you're looking for and why you're looking for it, to the example that you used, that's usually the outcome. And there's a reason why salespeople tend to churn um, at a greater rate than any other field, to the tune of like almost 3x. And that's what Bridge Group's data, which is crazy to me. Like, all the stats are just really troubling to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think SDRs now, it's what, 14 months, 12 to 14 months average tenure. I heard recently from somebody, VPs or CROs in the Valley, 18 months. I mean, it's like you have no continuity at that point in time. Of course, you can't build the culture you want. You can't establish the consistency you want in your sales process because you're churning people. You're always training people and onboarding.
Well, and especially for enterprise sales, if your sales leader is churning at 19 months and shrinking, and your enterprise seller is 18 months, or like it's between, I've read two things, 16 and a half or 18. So let's just say something between there. In enterprise sales, which is where I come from and where I spent
Mm-hmm.
my
Me too.
career, the party is just getting started then, right? Like, you've sown
Right.
all the seeds, and to just have things drop then, it's just so harmful to a business, let alone the buyer journey. And I just had this conversation yesterday where we were talking about enterprise sales and dispelling some of the misconceptions. You really get one major shot at that table. And if you screw it up, the chances of you re-engaging or having that door open back up again, they're nearly impossible, or it takes a long time, especially when it's multi-threaded and you've royally screwed up in front of
Mm-hmm.
everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just,
Yep.
I find that people don't think about the big picture. They think about the here and now. And all of this sort of is like the foundation of a house and building on that. And if that foundation isn't solid, the things that you're trying to build, they're not going to last very long. So there's an
Yeah.
analogy.
Well, well, especially if you're trying to have to re-engage because you're bringing a new seller onto the account, right? So if you've got an account with a 18 to 24 month sales cycle, which in enterprise is not unusual sometimes, depending on what you're selling. I certainly have had more than my share of those. You have somebody come in partway through, yeah, you're toast, right? You may have sort of this rule of thumb is that, your odds of winning a business are an inverse proportion to the number of times you have to tell the customer your story. You ask the customer to tell you their story. And it's like, yeah, they don't want to go through that again. They've already done that with somebody else. They don't want to go through discovery again or have somebody reconnect. And it doesn't matter how detailed a record you've got in CRM, there's still, a personal level discovery that needs to take place. So yeah, turnover is incredibly damaging.
If that's the
So
one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's the one thing that I'm most grateful for in my career is I came from the time when sales wasn't segmented the way that it is today, and I had to do every part of the job. And
Mm-hmm.
so understanding from soup to nuts, from all the pre-sale, all the pre-work, all the research, all the appointment setting, all the prospecting, all of that, through closing a deal, through landing and expanding, through retention,
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful for that. It's made me a better seller. It made me a better entrepreneur. It made me a better leader. And I think I'm also a buyer. This is my business.
Yep.
To your point, being passed over 10 different ways to Sunday and nobody's talking to each other, and I have to say the same thing, I'd rather not. I rather
Mm-hmm.
than find somebody that can answer my question when I need it to be answered.
Right. All right. So let's dig into what the process should be. So we say, okay, shortcuts, the shiny object syndrome, a great way of describing it. Obviously, the wrong way to go, though people still persisting in doing that. just give us an example of what you think a good process is for hiring, starting with the job description, or I even think there's a step before that called a job specification. So like you're designing a product, what is that specification you need for that person in that job?
I totally agree with that, by the way. You will not get an argument out of me for that statement, but
Okay.
I think it goes back even further than that of why hire now? Why is it time now? And for again, the ecosystem that I'm a part of, which is the startup ecosystem, there's this automatic correlation of I've got funding, I need to hire. And there's no
Right.
other reason why. And it's like, well, wait. Let's slow down to speed up, right? It's the intentionality piece that I think is really missing of the best things that I did. So sales and recruiting are not dissimilar in my mind. And when I
No, very
think
similar, right?
and when I think about the process that I've structured and created, it has a lot to do with what made me successful as a seller. And a lot of that goes back to the foundation of understanding and seeking to understand. And so I'm a big fan of intentionality and understanding why are we even hiring right now? What does our buyer journey really look like? So how many times do you know of people that say, well, it's time to go up market and we want to hire a big enterprise sales team, and they're not ready to do that. The product's not ready to do that. Customer success isn't ready to do that. You hire a bunch of heavy hitting, really remarkable people, and you really only have true runway to do that for 3 months, and it takes 18 months to build
Hmm.
that. You've got a problem. So I
Hmm.
think it's about a lot of self-awareness of asking those what, why, how, where questions, and formulating then to your point of, okay, before we even get to the job description, let's go to the next level. But my whole thing is the buyer holds the keys always. Doesn't matter
Right.
what I want, matters what they want. And so everything that I do tends to have that in mind and backtrack to that. So instead of hiring a whole cohort of people, I'd rather be really intentional about what the business needs today and build
Hmm.
from there once I learn what works, what doesn't work. So that's step one for me. And then I think it's about being intentional with the job description. And especially in today's landscape of, um, with all of sort of the social tension that we're going through, I can't tell you how many people are like, I need to hire a woman. I need to hire a person of color. I need to hire this. And it's like, but let's look back at your foundation. What's the story that you're trying to tell? So I think also in the hiring process, what's the footprint that you have externally speaking? What does your website look like? What do your Glassdoor reviews say? What are
Hmm.
your what are your former employees saying? We're living out loud now in this digital age, and the walls that we once could all hide behind for some of the icky behavior that happens, no more, or drastically reducing. So I think it's also about thinking in terms of how do we think about candidate experience? How do we think about what happens after the hire? So it's one thing to hire great people, it's another then to continue to support and enable them. So all of that
Hmm.
big picture thinking. And then it's the job description. How do we want to write that? Um, Keep in mind, it's kind of like a resume. A job description is an invitation for a conversation to confirm or deny whether the two parties make sense together. And all the different bits and pieces of writing in your acronyms and all these different things, like, stop that, right? What are the things that need to happen in this role for the person to be successful? And the language for anybody that is joining us today, the language that you use can either attract or repel people that you're trying to target. So
Hmm.
one thing that I hear about is how do I get more women in sales? Well, when you're talking about being hunters and killers and quota crushers and ninjas and all this stuff, and you're not talking about employee resource groups, and you're not talking about being supportive and the path ahead and all of these things, you're going to turn folks off. And especially if we're thinking about gender specifically, and there's all these other things to think
Hmm.
about. I'm just going for this for
Sure.
example.
Sure.
Studies have shown that women won't apply to a job unless they feel like they're 100% qualified, where men will roll the dice and just apply. So
Absolutely.
these are things to think about. So that's the next step, is the job description. And
Well,
then it's
but I think on that one is it's so important for people to understand is you can't minimize the impact of words, right? And the fact is that these words like extroverts, hunter, quota crusher, as I tell employers, is to the point you made earlier, Does your buyer need that? How does that apply to your buyer? Does your buyer want the salesperson to be a hunter? They don't, they don't give
Do
a
they want
damn
to
whether
be?
they're a hunter or not. They want somebody who can help them make a good decision, right?
Yeah.
So we have this contradiction, and I've written about this before. I say the one question a customer will never ask you is, "Hey, could you be more salesy?" Right?
Yeah.
Yet that's what we hire for. We put this list of attributes we want people to have to be salesy, and it's like, no, they don't want salesy. They want somebody who can help them. And to your point earlier, is from a personality standpoint, there has been research done that show that women are perhaps oftentimes more suited for this role than men.
Well, and there are things like, so there's a company called Textio. It helps you understand the words that you're using and how that displays to
Hmm.
general population, and it guides you along the way of Mayday, don't say this, or say this. And I just posted this earlier this week. There's a free gender decoder tool if you want to plug your job description in there. So there are ways to solve
Cool.
for this easily without recreating the wheel and making it a complete and total pain in the neck. That's where technology is our friend. And it's not a hack.
Mhm.
It's helpful. But I
Right.
think, having a job description that you can use really as a guide in the interview process of, these are the things that make this job, and this is what we need to keep in mind to keep us on task in a discussion. And then the next thing is thinking about a scorecard. I'm a huge fan of a scorecard and
I
taking
was
out.
going to bring that up.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's very rare these days that I don't have a conversation where that doesn't come up on both sides, looking for a job and through the hiring process. But I think sometimes we get caught up in those shiny objects, or the story we start telling ourselves isn't necessarily rooted in reality. And what I love about the scorecard is if you got really caught up in three things and there's four other things that you haven't uncovered that are germane to the task at hand, you owe it to yourself and to the company to really dig into those things to confirm or deny whether
Hmm.
this makes sense. So, scorecard for that.
Well,
I
so let's talk about the scorecard. So what's on the scorecard? Because different companies do it different ways, but I'm interested in what you recommend.
So my scorecard is customized to every client because, again, it's not a car wash of everybody looks the
Sure.
same. I think so. Some of the common themes
Hmm.
I think about. So everybody talks about culture fit, but nobody really can quantify it, or you've got lots of buzzwords. And I challenge my clients to understand, what does that mean to your company, right? What are we talking about here, and defining some of that. We talk about the stage, for example. So if you are an A round company, and this is no offense to anybody that comes from a big company, right? But if you're an A round and you're hiring a VP of sales, and you think that I just had this conversation with a VC and we're coming in to help one of their portfolio companies refill
Hmm.
a, a CRO that didn't work out for a variety of reasons. This individual came from a really big company, a Fortune 50 company. I'm going to leave the name out in case they're
Sure.
listening. A Fortune
I'm sure
50.
they are.
I mean, who isn't?
Yes, sir.
Everybody wants to hear us talk shop, Andy. Come on. But a Fortune 50 company that is notorious for phenomenal training. I would agree with the phenomenal training piece. But here's the thing, this was a middle manager with a title that this company got caught up in. And they figured, this person's been through this training. This person is part of this playbook that works really well for this other company. This company is a Fortune 50 company that's been around since dirt.
Hmm.
This leader didn't have to create the process, implement the process. This person was just enforcing the process.
Sure.
And so there was a big disconnect there, amongst other things. So I think stage and what work needs to be done at your stage, and for the near and the sort of midterm, what does that look like? Hire for that, right? What is the actual job? Do you have a sales process in place? If you don't, you might want to think about the importance of somebody having done that before and
Hmm.
knowing how to do that. So these are some of the things that I think about. I think about, operationally speaking, communication skills are huge for a sales leader. You want to make sure that not only that they can communicate in the verbal form, the written form, across the organization, up the organization, down the organization, at the board level. What does that look like? Do you have confidence in that? These are just some things to think about for a scorecard.
Sure. But as you identify those things, I think one of the critical things that's missing in most companies' hiring process is they don't actually, they say, look, these things are essential. We need to have this. It could be written communication skills as one. And then they never test it.
That's why people
So,
work from home.
well, but even if they hire you to do it, they still need to do it themselves, right? I mean, and so why is that? Why don't people take that extra step to say, this is really important for us, and we're going to test it? Yeah, give us a sample of writing, do something, right? How do I validate that they can do this important aspect of the job?
So that's where it comes to the next step. So yes, it correlates with the scorecard, but let's jump ahead, Andy. Then you're in the interview process. And I think what's really important to the interview process that a lot of people fail to realize is for every person that's involved in the interview process, why? And do they have the wherewithal to be able to peel back the layers on the things, whether it's in a conversation, whether it's some sort of assessment, whether it's some sort of project, whether there's a lot of different ways, and we'll talk about that specifically. But how many times have you heard about an interview that the CEO gets pulled into a meeting and you've got some rando person that has no idea how to interview or who this person is? They haven't taken a
Hmm.
look at who this person is. And it's like the CEO got caught up. You're going to meet with this person. It's like, so tell me about yourself. And they're thinking, like, what? And then that person's like, yeah, I don't like them. And you've got the most remarkable person for the job and this tremendous missed opportunity that just doesn't make sense to me. So I think if you know that the CEO is a flight risk, what's the backup plan? And is that person prepared, ready, willing to be able to jump in, right? So it's thinking about the big picture, not just the immediate term of who is responsible for what. We all use the scorecard. We all talk about this after the fact. And it's one of those things where everybody understands what their role is and how to interview. So that's one, but I think you have
Well,
something.
let me ask a question about that. So, what I'm seeing as sort of state of the art, let's say, in some organizations, and not necessarily sales per se, but I've seen it in sales, but is that when you have this, you set up a day, you got serial interviews, maybe 5 interviewers of the candidate, is of that, you maybe nominate one person that does the deep dive on the background and so on, but everybody else asks the exact same questions in the same order. So that when they debrief afterwards, they can say, well, how did they answer this question for you? And you have a common frame of reference until they evaluate, as opposed to, yeah, I thought they were good in the interview. You have no idea what they asked, right?
Well, that's why I like the intentionality of being able to come back together um, before and after, right? Meaning, so
Hmm.
like my clients, we talk before and after everything. With my candidates, we talk before and after each step.
Sure.
And part of that is to understand what's next. And it's not, people have this misnomer of, I'm going to use this information to tell a candidate what to say. And even if I did that, here's the funny part, the candidate actually has to do something with that. And that's an opportunity for you to see how they use that information,
Hmm.
right? It's interesting to me that there's like sort of this cloak and dagger or inability to communicate with each other of, hey, look, I had a great conversation. These are the things that we talked about. And keeping that part a little bit, because I don't like putting thoughts in people's head. I want an organic experience. But from my conversation, so I took this part of the scorecard. Can you take this part? And these are the questions to think about. And everybody, it's kind of like, what is your role? What do you
Hmm.
want to sell into? So if I'm a VP of sales, when I talk to the board, that's that part of the scorecard. When I talk to the CEO, it's this part of the scorecard. When I talk to the CFO, it's this, and it might be different things, and there might be a little bit of overlap there depending on what you're uncovering. But to your point, Andy, which I think is really important, how do you actually know? How do you really see? How do you reduce that margin for error? And it's about being able to see. It's kind of like, show me you know what you're talking about. Don't just tell me. I'm a huge fan of forget about your 36, 90-day plan, forget
Hmm.
about the presentation, forget about
Right.
like the song and dance. Um, I like being able to peel back the layers together to do some of the work together. I'm a big fan of getting down and dirty in the nitty gritty details for a half a day with an intentional agenda of these are the 3 things that this role is going to solve for the most in the
Hmm.
next year. We'll sign mutual NDAs. I'm going to give you my data. And these are the things that I really want to see in terms of how you're thinking about it.
Yep. Yep.
Are you pointing out blind spots? Usually there's some prep and collaboration leading up to that. How did they show up for that? Are they asking questions? Are they genuinely curious? That's where the magic happens. I just had this with a client. It's for an SVP of sales role. We had 2 people go through this. It was the final 2. The one person treated it like a table of contents, like a presentation, even though we said, here's the impetus of this.
Right.
You're going to have 4 hours to do this. They got done in an hour and he just whizzed through it. The other person, they went over the time. And then he thoughtfully followed up with like, so our conversation has me thinking about this. Here are a few resources for that. You get to see how people are in the wild, so to speak.
It's so important. Very, very important. And it's funny, your story, because it reminded me of a story I had with a client. We were looking for a VP of sales. Same thing. We hired a national search agency to help. And we got it down to 3 candidates. Similar scenario that you described. We're going to have people spend some time with us to develop, some thinking about, perhaps what they might do in this one particular area. I think it was sort of a go-to-market plan for one new city that we're going into. And yeah, one of the 3 said, well, that sounds like consulting. I'm not going to do that. And it's like, dude, you realize you're the finalist, one of the 3 finalists on this thing. It's like, sorry, it's the candidates too. To your point, it's the candidates have to come in with the right mindset. And then you have to really make sure you set the stage well as the interviewing company and make sure they really understand. But yeah, if you're looking for a senior role, you have to be prepared at this point in time to say, look, I gotta show my goods.
You brought up, it gets brought up on a bunch of my content all the time, Andy, when these topics come up. The whole thing of, I don't want to give away free consulting. At that point, I have lots of thoughts. Sorry, I'm like, let me just collect my thoughts for a second.
Sure.
I always tell people, like, you have a choice. I can't tell you what to do.
Mhm.
We're at the point of, you need to lean in or you don't. And if you feel like you're giving away free advice and that this is icky, there's two ways to think about this. One, if you're afraid that they're going to use your plan, that would mean that the person that they hire, and that's not you, that has their own plan, is going to rip your plan off and know the body of work that led up to that and the impetus of where all this comes from. So there's that, which I don't think is really realistic. And then on the other side, if you're feeling icky about this, or you feel like they're doing something devious at this stage, when we're at the end here to do this, maybe it's not the right role for you. If there are trust
Oh yeah.
issues, maybe it's time to say no, thank you. And that sort of stuns people. We're like, wait, you either lean in and make a commitment to the fact that this is your career, this is your life, this is a big decision, and it's a big decision for them as well. And if you want to defy the 19-month odds sort of ratio here, you got to lean in. And if you don't want to, okay, please carry on, and best of luck to you.
Well, yeah, and I think the other aspect of it is just you gotta set your ego aside, right? Is as I told this gentleman who refused to do it, I said, here's the thing: is no matter what you tell us, because you have no background, whatever you tell us, it's probably gonna be wrong. Not that that's bad, or there is no right answer, right?
Yeah.
But it's not. You don't know enough. What we're just looking for is the quality of thinking, right? How do you process? How do you problem solve, and so on with a limited information set? You know, that's fine. You're not going to say anything that we're going to run to the bank and think, oh, this person struck gold. Not at all. So if you're in that situation as a candidate, yeah, set the ego aside because
And for hiring managers, for anybody that's here having this sort of scenario, you also have to ask yourself, how have you acted through the process? Have you created a safe place where both of you can come together to share, right? Because sometimes not sometimes, let's just call it out. The hiring process is broken by and large, and people just approach it of like, here are the steps. I read this article in this place, and this is how you hire, and this is what I'm going to do, and it's plug and play. They have no idea why they're asking for what they're asking for. They have no idea to evaluate it, and they have no idea what's going to be done with that evaluation.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
candidates are sensitive to that, right? Just like on the flip side, for what we're talking about from the candidate side, I always say, and I don't play poker, but I look for the tells. And if the hiring side has shown up and it's been collaborative and it's been open and it's been proactive and I know what to expect and we're talking and this is really about confirming or denying, then I do need to check my ego aside and I need to show up. And I have this manifesto of I can't care more about scaling your business than you do, and I cannot care more about your career than you do. And if I start doing that in my world,
Mhm.
we have problems, right? Like then we have to go back and we have to have a defining conversation. But that's the thing is, and especially in the market that we just came out of, you could get away with that ego stuff because there was such a shortage. Now
Mhm.
that things are starting to turn a little bit, and it's not a candidate driven market right now, it's a client driven market. And so if you want to show up that way and you're calling me being like the market's really tough, you might have to have a tough conversation with self
Right.
to understand how are you putting yourself out there, and you're going to have to lean in a little bit more to stand out a lot more because the
Mhm.
candidates are higher for you because it's really competitive.
Yeah. So, sort of a last question for you is well, I see that one thing companies don't do is they create a process and a scorecard, and then they don't track the history of that, right? They don't say, okay, we've used this process and this scorecard to hire, let's say, 10 salespeople. They never go back and say, how'd they turn out, right?
Yeah.
Did the process work? I mean, is this serving us or is it not serving us? Why aren't they doing that? And what could they do?
I think it's like everything, right? It's in the sales process of just getting caught up in the new logos and not thinking about churn, right? I read this article that said um, retention is the new growth. And I almost jumped out the window because I was like, the new growth, like it's always been. What are you talking
Right,
about?
it's always been the growth, right?
It's the same thing, right? In my mind, why do I think it's happening? I think that it's then competing priorities and it's just the next thing that comes up. Uh, I recommend when it comes to a scorecard in a hiring process, and it tethers back to this, you always, at a minimum, want to go back to it on a quarterly basis because there's always going to be something new that you learn. Your business is evolving, it's growing.
Hmm.
You might want to tweak it, and that's a phenomenal opportunity to look back to the churn. Because a lot of people, like when we started this out, Andy, and we were talking about what mishiring looks like in
Right.
reality and what that cost is to a business, most people don't look at it that way. They just look at it as I need to hire again, but not what that actually cost you. And I think when people go back, right, that audit of the quarterly basis is a phenomenal time to bake that in. So it's not just another thing that you have to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great point. I just would add, I think managers, hiring companies is track the results. Yeah, what did your interview process turn up and how'd that correlate to success with the people that you've hired? And I see companies that just don't look at that data at all. That's like, you have the data. let's be data driven on how we're doing this. It exists. Let's just be a little smarter and more effective, as you talked about.
Well, it's the data that I choose to, just because there's data, there's data, it's what you do with it. And I find
Hmm.
people sort of pick and choose the data that they want to see to
Sure.
tell the story that they want to tell. And churn is ugly. It's not fun to talk about that for your own team, for your own customers. I think human nature is like, let's just talk about what we want to win, not what
Yeah.
we're.
Yeah. And it perpetuates itself up and down the hiring process and the people that support hiring. I mean, I always laugh when I hear from companies that sell assessments that say we've got a high, like 100% correlation with success of people that get the score on our assessments. Like, no. If only 48% of sellers are making quota, it's not happening. So yeah, we
Well,
just have to be honest with yourself.
a solution to that, especially for earlier stage companies that don't have an HR team, because normally HR looks at this, right? If you
Sure.
don't have an HR team, um, there are really great ways to measure this. There are applicant tracking systems that are not so robust and so expensive. There are free applicant tracking systems where it's really easy to just track that and be able to go back and look at
Mhm.
that. So it's not like you always have to manually think about it or develop a
Right.
spreadsheet or your table or like you don't. It doesn't have to be that complex. It can be a simple thing that this is the person that we hired. This is the cost that we hired them. This is how long it took because there's a cost to that, right? Like let's go back to the 300 hours
Mhm.
on average. Like these are the things you can see all of that with even the simplest of applicant tracking systems, and there are free applicant tracking
Right.
systems that data lives.
Yeah. Perfect. All right, Amy, we sort of run out of time here. So,
Andy,
say that again?
time flies when you're having fun.
It does fly when you're having fun. So, I don't see any questions, but if people have questions want to submit it after the fact, we'll get them to Amy, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer them.
Yes, please. My hotline's always on, as I like to say. So
And do you want to give that out real quickly, what that is?
So the best way to find me, get me where I spend a lot of time would be on good old LinkedIn, Amy Volas, and I'm the only Amy Volas there, and it's Volas. So
Perfect. Perfect. And she's on there a lot. So I can attest. All right. Well, Amy, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
thank you, Andy. I appreciate it.